Grace didn't even want to attend the dinner. The email came at exactly 9:47 a.m. Subject: Dinner with the Coles, Friday, 7 p.m. Please like and subscribe to my channel so as to stay glued for more content like this. It came from Human Resources, wrapped in a formal invite with a cheerful smiley face tacked on, as if that would soften the blow. After 22 years of building data core systems from a dusty warehouse startup into a global tech giant, Grace Adebayo was being summoned, not to a boardroom or strategy session, but to dinner with the CEO's family. She stared at the screen, heart heavy. This wasn't a reward. It was a signal. She was the first person ever hired at DataCore. Not just an employee. She was the backbone. Back then, there were only 3 clients, a single server that wheezed when overloaded, and one ancient printer that jammed at the sight of paper. Grace handled everything: client systems, vendor contracts, finances, until they could afford a CFO. She negotiated deals that kept the lights on. Franklin Cole, the founder, once called her the quiet engine. She kept things moving when everything else threatened to fall apart. But something had shifted lately. Franklin's replies had turned cold. Meetings were missed. Updates went unread. Their Monday check-ins slowly dissolved into biweekly calls. Then came the interns, young, loud, spilling buzzwords like popcorn. Grace could feel the cold wind creeping in, even before they opened the window. So when she received that dinner invite, she knew something was coming. She just didn't realize how cold it would be. The dinner was hosted at a fancy rooftop restaurant in the city. All sleek lighting and overpriced scallops. She wore a soft navy blouse and the pearl earrings her daughter gifted her last Mother's Day. She looked sharp, still every inch the executive she always was. Franklin stood at a long white-clothed table, beaming, his wife Thelma at his side and their daughter Savannah, who looked like a polished ad for leadership chic. Blonde, perfect posture, glowing in a linen pantsuit that probably cost a month's salary. Grace. Franklin opened his arms wide, like nothing had changed. So glad you made it. Wouldn't miss it, she said smoothly, slipping into her seat across from them. Her smile stayed intact, but her stomach knotted like a twisted rope. She knew this wasn't just dinner. It was a performance. She just didn't know who was playing who. Dinner began like every executive gathering. Too much wine and too many empty compliments. Savannah asked about the company's early days with a curious tone that barely masked condescension. So wild imagining you guys working out of, like, a garage or something, she giggled. Grace smiled. It wasn't funny at the time. Franklin cleared his throat. Actually, Grace saved the company twice in the first 5 years. She closed the defense contract that earned us our first $1 million. Savannah smirked. Well, every company needs its building blocks. Grace should have walked out right then, but she stayed. She wanted to see how far they'd go. Halfway through the main course, halibut over saffron rice, Franklin folded his hands on the table like a man preparing to deliver bad news wrapped in politeness. Grace, we've been thinking about the company's future, he began. You've been more than instrumental in building DataCore into what it is today. Grace didn't flinch. She kept her face calm. Here it comes, she thought. But as we position ourselves for the next phase, we believe it's time to bring in fresh energy. A new vision. Grace nodded slowly, saying nothing. Her silence was heavy, thoughtful, but inside her stomach turned again. Franklin beamed as he added, Savannah just finished her executive leadership program at Stanford. He said it like Grace hadn't mentored 5 Ivy League grads herself. She's got incredible ideas, blockchain, AI, new branding strategies. Impressive, Grace replied evenly. What's the transition plan? He seemed relieved by her calmness. 6 weeks. She'll shadow you, then we'll make a formal announcement after the quarterly call. Of course, there's a generous package. Grace didn't react. That's when Savannah leaned forward, fork in hand, her eyes sharp. Time to step aside, Granny, she said with a smirk. Let us take it from here. The table fell silent. Even Thelma's fork paused midair. Grace held Savannah's gaze, then offered a small smile. Completely understand. Because what they didn't know, what they had forgotten, was that Grace wasn't just an employee. She was an owner. Years ago, Franklin had handed her 5% equity when they couldn't afford a raise. She'd never sold it, never mentioned it. She simply watched quietly, observing as things changed, as she was pushed further aside. But that paper he gave her in 2003, it wasn't symbolic. It was legal, binding, and very real. She still had voting rights. They'd just forgotten. Grace remembered it clearly. In 2003, they were nearly bankrupt. She'd stayed up all night fixing a billing disaster that almost lost them their biggest client. The next morning, Franklin walked into her office, exhausted, desperate, and handed her a signed agreement. "I can't pay you what you're worth right now," he'd said. "But if we make it through this, I want you to have a piece of it." At the time, it felt more like a gesture of thanks than a real deal. But years later, when investors came in, Grace had a lawyer check it, and it held up. The equity was real, with voting rights, ownership. She never waved it around, never brought it up. She thought she didn't need to. She was part of the company's foundation. But data core changed. Franklin changed. Consultants arrived, interns multiplied, and suddenly loyalty was replaced by optics. They wanted people who looked good on stage, not the ones who built the stage. But Grace still showed up that Monday like nothing happened. She smiled at the receptionist, took her usual black coffee from the temperamental machine, sat down at her desk, logged in. Her access was still active. No announcements, just silence. Around mid-morning, Tommy, the data engineer, peeked into Grace's office. He had that cautious look he wore whenever something was off. "You okay?" he asked softly. Grace gave a small nod. "Just had dinner with the Coles." Tommy winced. "Yeah, I've heard. People are talking. Everyone's confused." Grace met his eyes and said, quietly, "Let them wonder." She wasn't ready to show her hand, not yet. As soon as Tommy left, she pulled up the shareholder portal. Her 5% was still intact. And with new investors adding capital, that small slice had grown into something powerful. Very powerful. Grace downloaded everything: stock agreements, board voting history, executive pay packages. Then she walked over to Franklin's assistant's desk. "Could I get 30 minutes with Franklin? Privately." The assistant blinked. I'll check his calendar." "Thank you," Grace said, calm and polite. When Wednesday came, she stepped into Franklin's office. He looked up with a rehearsed smile. "Grace," he said warmly, "how are things?" She sat down across from him, her voice even. "Curious. You didn't mention the equity I still hold." His smile flickered. "I assumed you cashed out by now." "I didn't," she said, placing a printed agreement on his desk. "Unless I missed something," Grace continued. "I still have voting rights." Franklin leaned back, folding his hands. "Grace, there's no need to make this complicated. We're offering a generous exit." "I'm not leaving yet," she replied. "I'll support the transition. I'll do it with grace. But if Savannah plans to restructure, bring in her own team, or sell assets, I want my say." His face tightened. "You're holding on to sentimentality." "No," she said. "I'm holding on to what I built." She stood up and left before he could speak again. Let him sit in it. Let him feel the weight. That night, Grace opened the old file cabinet in her home office. Inside were relics of Datacore's early days. Handwritten meeting notes, client pitch ideas, even rough sketches of software on paper napkins. Then she found something she hadn't looked at in years. A 2005 NDA, signed by Franklin himself. It acknowledged that several core tools Grace had built were derived from systems she designed during her previous consulting work. Proprietary, protected, forgotten by everyone except her. She set the file aside and reached for her phone. She texted Kemi, a longtime friend and now one of the city's top IP attorneys. The next morning, Grace and Kemi met at a quiet bistro near Datacorp's headquarters. Over warm tea and thick folders, Grace laid it all out. "Can I protect this?" she asked. Kemi flipped through the documents, eyes lighting up. "Grace, this isn't just protection. You own a piece of this, at least some of it, and combined with your equity, that's real leverage." Grace leaned back in her seat, exhaling for the first time in days. "They think I'm a stepping stone." Kemi smiled. "Then let's remind them, stones can crack foundations." Grace nodded slowly. It was time to set the pace. By Friday, the whispers were growing louder. Staff started to notice the calm in Grace's stride. Why hadn't Savannah officially taken over? Why was Grace still walking the halls, still smiling? Amara, Grace's trusted operations lead, cornered her near the break room. "They're nervous," she said in a low voice. "Savannah's making changes that don't make sense. Franklin's not saying a word." Grace nodded. "That's because he's not in charge anymore. He just doesn't realize it yet." Amara blinked. "Then what are you doing?" Grace looked her in the eye and replied calmly, setting the table. "For what?" "The storm." That evening, Grace sat on her porch, a glass of red wine in hand and her laptop balanced on her knees. The breeze was gentle, but her thoughts were sharp. She had 3 emails drafted. The first, addressed to the remaining board members, reminded them of her equity stake and a clause requiring unanimous board consent for executive restructuring. The second, to David Osei, the CEO of Technova Systems, a potential buyer who had shown interest before. And the third, to herself. Subject line, leverage. She saved it all in a secured drive. This wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. The announcement came the following Tuesday morning, a mandatory staff meeting. Savannah took the stage in the company auditorium like a polished speaker at a tech summit, wireless mic in hand. She paced while stock photos and vague slogans glowed behind her. Vision, velocity, victory. Franklin introduced her as a breath of fresh air. Savannah thanked him like she'd won a crown. Then came the line, "It's time for a new chapter, a younger, leaner, and more innovative Datacorp." Grace sat in the second row, arms folded, expression unreadable. Amara looked stunned. Tommy wouldn't even meet her eyes. Then the slide appeared, organizational streamlining plan. Phase 1. Grace's jaw tensed. It was all there. Cuts to back-end operations, outsourced IT support, merging key departments, and the cruelest blow, legacy management transition. They didn't say her name, but they didn't have to. After the meeting, Savannah found Grace in the hallway, alone, confident. "I hope you'll be graceful about this," she said. "It's what people expect from veterans." Grace tilted her head. "You mean women who outlived 3 CEOs and built the systems this company still depends on?" Savannah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Exactly," she said. That afternoon, HR sent Grace an official exit package, a check with a lot of zeros, an NDA, and a clause demanding full knowledge transfer. That's when they pushed too far. Grace walked straight into Franklin's office, the folder in hand. He was already bracing. "Grace, you let your daughter call me obsolete in front of the company," she said. "You want me to smile, nod, and hand over my life's work like some tired old secretary. It's not like that." "It's exactly like that," she snapped. "And let me be clear, I'm not signing anything. Not now. Not ever." Franklin sighed, already weary. "Then you leave us no choice. We'll have to terminate." Grace calmly reached into her bag and pulled out a printed agreement. "You're forgetting something," she said, placing it on his desk. "I still hold a shareholder seat. If you force me out without full board approval, you'll breach the original agreement." His face drained of color. "Savannah's plans may look flashy, but cutting back-end operations will crumble your infrastructure. And her automation model? It violates client contracts. You know that. Franklin said nothing, just slumped in his seat. I'm not trying to sink the ship, Grace added, but I won't let you sink me with it. That night, Grace met Tommy and Amara at a quiet diner across town. She slid 2 manila envelopes across the table. What is this? Amara asked, cautious. Proof, Grace replied. What we built isn't just code. It's intellectual property, documented, time-stamped, and legally traceable. Tommy leaned forward. You're going to sue? Not unless they force me to, Grace said. But I want both of you protected. Savannah's planning another round of cuts. Amara sighed. She's got the PR team preparing a press release. Looks like they're clearing the decks for a sale. Grace nodded. Data cores being turned into a product. Streamlined, packaged, but not protected. Over the next 3 days, Grace worked like a ghost. Quiet, deliberate, invisible to those who weren't watching closely. She met with Kemi again and filed a cease and desist letter over the unauthorized reuse of her modules. She sent a formal board notice opposing the restructuring unless a third-party audit was completed. She also met with David Osei again, this time over lunch. Just a friendly chat, until she casually mentioned the instability at DataCore. They're prepping for a sale, she said. David raised an eyebrow. Interesting, he murmured. We've had your engineers reaching out already. Grace smiled. Let me show you where the value really is. By Friday, the cracks had started to show. Savannah's big initiatives were failing. The vendor migration she promised was stalled. Tommy had quietly disabled a compatibility patch he'd written himself. The rebranding initiative was pulled after the legal team flagged it for infringing a small firm's trademark. Grace might have tipped them off. The flashy new predictive analytics model? It crashed during its first client test. Garbage in, garbage out. Savannah didn't back down. She doubled down, called another leadership meeting. We're going through growing pains, she insisted. Disruption isn't easy, but it's necessary. Grace raised an eyebrow. Disruption needs parachutes. You've cut everyone. After the meeting, Amara pulled Grace aside. 3 of our longest clients called today, she whispered. 1 is threatening to leave. They're worried about their systems. Grace nodded. Let me guess. Savannah hasn't replied. She thinks they'll wait. They won't, Grace said. That evening, Grace wrote a 2-line email to David. Subject, follow-up from lunch. If your board is serious, now is the time to move. The next morning, she found Savannah in her old office, feet on the desk tossing a stress ball. Can I help you? Savannah asked like Grace was a nuisance. Actually, yes, Grace said. You're losing the company. Savannah looked up, her smirk faltering. You think I don't know what I'm doing? No, Grace replied. I think you never bothered to ask what we were doing before you arrived. You're quoting buzzwords. But this company isn't built on slogans. It's built on trust, on real systems. You don't know the difference. Savannah stood, tense. Are you threatening me? I'm offering a chance, Grace said, to stop pretending you're in control and start listening to the people who built this place. She turned to leave. You want to lead? Fine. Just don't burn the foundation to prove you can light a match. Later that day, Franklin asked to see Grace privately. No assistance. No Savannah. He looked older, worn down. Grace, he said, what do you want? She paused. I want recognition. Not money. Not a title. Recognition. He rubbed his temples. The board is nervous. Your name is still tied to everything that works. They're seeing the fallout. They should, Grace replied. You gave $1 million engine to someone who's never driven a car. And Technova? Franklin asked. Grace didn't answer, just smiled faintly. David's offer is real, but I haven't decided. He looked at her, really looked. You could walk away. I could, she said, but I won't. That evening, Grace got a text from Amara. Client X just sent a formal letter to the board. They're concerned. Grace responded with 2 words. Hold steady. Savannah had the mic, but Grace had the stage. The following Thursday, the boardroom was full. Emergency session. Franklin at the head, hollow-eyed. Savannah sat beside him, flipping through a leather notebook she hadn't used once. Across from Grace sat David Osei, silent and observant. Before we begin, said Mrs. Banjo, the board chair, we need to address the elephant in the room. She nodded to Grace. Ms. Adebayo has submitted critical items not disclosed in our internal review. Murmurs rippled across the room. Franklin looked pale. Savannah stiffened. As per our original agreement, Mrs. Banjo continued, any restructuring affecting stakeholders with more than 3% requires unanimous board approval. She turned to Grace. Would you like to speak? Grace stood steady. I gave 2 decades to this company, she began. But somewhere along the line, loyalty became a liability. I don't want a crown. I don't need applause. But I do want my work respected. I want my voice heard. Because innovation means nothing if it's built on broken trust. David cleared his throat. Our offer still stands, but not under current leadership. The room went quiet. Translation. Savannah had to go. Mrs. Banjo called a 10-minute recess. When they returned, she announced the decision. Effective immediately, Savannah Cole is relieved of all leadership duties. Franklin will serve in an advisory role. Grace Adebayo will lead the transitional advisory team, working directly with Technova. Grace didn't smile. She just nodded. 2 months later, Data Core became part of Technova. Grace chose Amara to lead operations. Tommy took over engineering. Grace worked from home, sipping coffee by the lake. One evening, she received an email from Mrs. Banjo. What you did, Grace, that's what real leadership looks like.